Racism and black activism was much more prevalent and unequivocal in the 60s and 70s compared to today, where it has evolved into a more covert and concealed form of racism. Now, racism appears in a more roundabout way when compared to the past. Today, we see a lot more de facto segregation, which is when segregation of groups is not intentionally legislated yet still appears in society. There were laws that legally prevented black and white students from attending school together. At the time, schools refused to be integrated and black students were denied the same education as white students. Instances like the Brown v. Board of Education, which rendered racial segregation unconstitutional, or Ruby Bridges, who was the first African American student to integrate into an all-white school, were catalysts for change and the legal desegregation of schools. Although the initial issue of legal segregation has been resolved, there is still de facto segregation that appears all over the education system. The system today still fails to give black students equal opportunities. One of the main examples of this is public versus private schooling. Private schools are available only to those who can afford to attend them, creating segregation based on economic status, as many black students live in areas that are not as nice or economically stable.
60s and 70s. So segregating housing we're talking about, segregated neighborhoods, housing discrimination, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So during this time, black families were frequently turned away from pursuing better housing opportunities because of their race. This ultimately impacted and deprived black people from quality schools, education, housing, and other public services. So if you would see, um, black people were withheld from the educational opportunities that white people had, and we were not given the same opportunities and the same resources and things to further our education. However, now we've come very far. There are plenty of opportunities for us that are given to us on a daily basis, and we're just making sure that those opportunities stay open to us, and everything stays consistent. De facto segregated housing today, speaking of residential segregation, raising rent, mortgage extremely high compared to average, right? Which affects, you know, minorities, because if we can't pay it, then we have to move out, and it kind of leaves the white people to just continue as they were. Better neighborhoods equals better opportunities slash resources. Residential segregation is still prevalent to this day, often creating more barriers for African Americans to obtain better housing, often raising prices of homes way beyond median income in the area to keep lower income minority families out. So this happens a lot. Gentrification, a lot of nice areas raise their rent and raise their mortgages. Therefore, the minorities are no longer allowed to. I mean, we can't live there anymore because we can no longer afford it. So we're moving out and going where? Back to the Section 8 housing and the cheaper housing. Segregated healthcare in 60s and 70s. Lack of black medical officials, Jim Crow laws applied in hospitals, no intermingling by law. Many African Americans were denied emergency services, and Jim Crow impacted hospitals by refraining intermingling from black patients and white doctors/nurses, considering that at the time it was legal to do so. Also, saw a lack of black medical officials due to the almost non-exist educational opportunities, making it even more rare to find suitable health care. Um, this kind of makes me think about the fact that um, the percentage of black women, okay, who are more likely to die in the hands of a white doctor.
Further technological and medical research without reimbursement. Um, Take, for example, Henrietta Lacks, who was a major contributor to the HeLa cell medical scene, right, where she contributed a large part of medical research, um, and how her cells were used without permission, right? That's kind of not cool. Next slide, right? Where we'll be talking about segregated policing in the 60s and 70s. All right. Now, due to the Jim Crow laws and the consistent presence of riots to battle these injustices, the police forces were primarily white and targeted black people. The police were upholding the order of segregation and discrimination against black people, while openly expressing and supporting these racist ideologies embedded within the law and society, right? And so we're talking about how these laws implement themselves within the system and incorporate themselves within uh, police officers, right, which then enact and proliferate this systemic racism. A result of that can be seen through Rodney King's in the 90s, the beating of Rodney King, and the killing of George Floyd, right, in contemporary society, right. Now these injustices were very prevalent even before then, but it wasn't until the rise of cameras and video recordings is it brought to light. Okay, next I'm going to be moving to the next slide, de facto segregated policing today. The police are far more active and present in these Black low-income communities and are often more likely to be targeted due to racial profiling and police brutality, leading to the creation of movements such as Black Lives Matter that addresses and speaks out against these injustices and subtle racial tensions in our society. Now, an example of racial profiling can be the stop and frisk, the New York policy stop and frisk, right, where they racially profiled people of color, especially Black African Americans, solely for the color of their skin, right? Albeit they did capture a lot of crime. People's POC's civil liberties were compromised, and that violates the core principles of the Constitution.